Very often, this is someone that the child perceives as a loving relationship. It's the entry point into trafficking, and very often that's actually a family member.
Close your eyes for a second. What do you think of when you hear the words human trafficking? What image pops up? And it's always like the duct tape. It's always like the hand over the mouth. There's always like somebody thrown in a basement. So a victim would say, like, that's not me. Like, I can walk around my neighborhood. I can, I go to school. I'm free to do those things. And it's so much more than that physical, it's that psychological chains that are holding them.
Whenever we're going to represent something horrific that has happened, whenever we're going to represent someone else's pain, I think it's always worth asking that question of, why am I doing this? Am I doing this for my gain? Am I doing this for my organization's gain? Am I doing this for my political party's gain? Or am I genuinely trying to raise awareness on this issue?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for a Grace Live conversation on human trafficking. We have a couple of incredible guests with us today, Robert Peters and Angie Conn, and I'll introduce them shortly. As we get going today, just a couple of things before we get started. Again, thank you for coming today. It's a heavy topic as we talk about human trafficking. And so if you find that you need a break at some point during this conversation, please know that it's okay to take that break, to step away for a little bit. This will be recorded and placed on our YouTube channel, so you can view it again later. So please feel free to take care of yourselves in whatever way that you need to during this time. I mentioned that YouTube channel. A Grace Live conversation is something that we do about once a month here. And all of those past conversations are on our YouTube channel. So please do go ahead and check out our YouTube channel, where you will find at this point nearly 30 hours of content from these Grace Live conversations. In November, we will be, instead of our Grace Live conversation, having our fall fundraising campaign. And it would be great if you could join us for that fall fundraising campaign. There was a slide to that effect explaining that it's a person-to-person peer fundraising campaign, and we'd love to have you join us in that. You can find out more by going to our website, and we can walk you through the steps of setting up a peer-to-peer fundraising page. Please note that as we go through that starts on November 16th. On November 20th, we will be having a board event where members of the board of directors at Grace will be sharing some of their heart and some of the things that have brought them to Grace, and also some of the things that they've seen that we've been able to help churches with and help survivors with through the Every Church Empowered Fund. And then on November 27th, we will have our keynote by Scott McKnight, author of the book A Church Called Tove, and he'll be presenting our keynote address on November 27th. The event will end on December 3rd. So we'd love to have all of you participate if you're open to that, and join us for these events. As we have this discussion today, please feel free to add questions and comments that you may have in the chat or the Q&A section. We'll try and get to a couple of those questions at the tail end of the program today. But if we're not able to get to your question, then please do send that question, email it to info@netgrace.org, and we'd love to be able to follow up then on the questions that you may have for us if we're not able to get to them today. If you want to learn more about grace, godly response to abuse in the Christian environment, please feel free to check out our website, www.netgrace.org. Our mission, really what drives us and sustains us here at Grace, is a desire to equip Christian faith communities to do a better job recognizing, preventing, and responding to all forms of abuse, all forms of misconduct. Unfortunately, one of those forms of misconduct that we often encounter and that can be related to faith communities is human trafficking. And today we have two incredible guests that are going to help us to better understand what is human trafficking and what is involved with that, and what can we do both as communities and as individuals to better recognize, prevent, and respond to human trafficking. Robert Peters and Angie Conn bring incredible experience from different backgrounds. And so I'm going to ask Robert and Angie, both of you, just to introduce yourselves and let us know who you are and just some of your background as we enter into this conversation on human trafficking.
All right, I'll go first. Great to be with you, Pete, and all of you that are in attendance. My name is Robert Peters. I'm Director of Institutional Response at Grace. I briefly served, well, not briefly, I guess it was a couple of years, on the West Virginia Human Trafficking Task Force. I was the sole state prosecutor on that task force at the time. When I worked at NW3C, the National White Collar Crime Center, led content development trainings related to human trafficking, and we've also been privileged to partner with law enforcement agencies and nonprofit organizations in some proactive operations oriented towards human trafficking. So it's always been a passion of mine, alongside my background in child abuse prosecution and sexual assault prosecution, and so always a privilege to intersect on this important topic. Angie?
Hello, everyone. I'm Angie Conn. I am an independent consultant that works around the United States, really partnering with agencies and organizations that work with vulnerable populations, so like youth in foster care and youth at risk. And I also do the Ending the Game facilitator trainer. Ending the Game is an intervention curriculum for those that have been identified as being trafficked or exploited, and also the Cool Aunt series, which is a prevention curriculum. I work with Children's Home Society here in West Virginia, and so I wear many hats, work at many different amazing opportunities to really educate and really help people understand what trafficking looks like in their neighborhood. And I've been in this field for going on 8 years now, so it's just my honor to be able to have this platform to really talk to people and have conversation. So awesome. Glad to be here.
Awesome. Thank you both very much for joining us and for having this conversation. So as we jump into this conversation on human trafficking, it's really helpful to make sure that we're just all on the same page and that we know what we're even talking about when we say human trafficking. Robert, can you start us off with just a basic understanding of what is human trafficking? How would it be defined?
Yeah, and I'll approach it sort of from a drier legal perspective, just with my background in prosecution. There's three fundamental elements as trafficking is defined at the federal level. And of course, there's many states have statutes related to human trafficking as well. And so there's some variation, of course, across laws in different jurisdictions, but most of them tend to mirror some of the primary elements of the federal statute. And those three main elements are some sort of action, some sort of means, and some sort of purpose. And so I'll start with the purpose element. Trafficking, in order for trafficking to be committed, it has to be these acts done with the purpose of there being some commercial sex acts or labor and services. So when we speak of human trafficking, we're not just talking about sex trafficking, though that's what gets more of the headlines, gets more of the attention. We're also talking about labor trafficking and the horrific situation that folks find themselves coerced into on that side of it as well. So that's the purpose element, and that again, that commercial emphasis. Then there's the means element. The means is referring to force, fraud, or coercion. One of those pieces is being employed with that purpose. So when we say force, that might be physical force. It might be actual physical restraint. Though that's really, as I'm sure Angie and I will highlight throughout, that's really a minority dare I say an extreme minority of cases where you see literal physical compulsion, at least at the entry point. Perhaps there's compulsion later on and violence later on, but that initial entry point, very rare. Or there's fraud, presenting something that appears to be a wonderful opportunity when it's really not. And then coercion, perhaps that's psychological coercion, perhaps that's threats, perhaps that's promises, manipulative promises, putting an individual into a situation where there really is no way out, or no perceived way out. And then that brings us to the third element. So we have the purpose, we have the means, and then we have the action. The action in statutes is actually pretty broad. Which is good. I like that as a prosecutor. It gives a lot of flexibility from a charging perspective. And so that can be recruiting, enticing, harboring, transporting, providing, obtaining, advertising, maintaining, a host of different verbs, soliciting, patronizing, with those means, force, fraud, or coercion, for that purpose, the commercial sex act or labor services. So that's it at a high level from a legal perspective, though I sense that Angie may have a more in-depth take on what it actually looks like.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. Yeah, I mean, it's all of those things, and I will like throw in with labor trafficking. You do see a little more violence than in the beginning too than sex trafficking, and labor and sex trafficking many times overlap. You know, people that are being labor trafficked sometimes will also be pushed back and forth. And so, it just looks a lot of different ways, right? I think the one word that you said in the definition that people most misunderstand is coercion, because coercion is that illusion of choice. And so even the victim doesn't realize they're a victim when they're being coerced, because the trafficker makes them feel like it's their choice, and they are giving them choice. They make it the illusion of choice, like they are giving them choice and participating in that relationship. And so many times people misunderstand how coercion is probably the largest piece of trafficking here in the United States, at least.
Yeah, I really like how you describe coercion as giving the illusion of choice. There isn't somebody in many of these situations, there isn't somebody physically forcing and compelling, but the coercion in all these different ways gives the illusion of some level of choice, and that can really have a huge impact on the person being trafficked, as well as those of us looking at the situation, and we don't see the coercion, we just see the illusion of choice.
Yeah, because many times people are saying, well, why don't they just run? Like, if it's so bad there, like, why don't they just run away? And what they don't see is all those layers underneath. They don't see what the person has experienced before they were trafficked. They don't see how that relationship with the trafficker has formed, and the unhealthiness. Because in the beginning, a trafficker doesn't start out by saying, hey, this is what I'm going to do to you, and this is what you're going to do. Many times, it's just that gradual expansion of boundaries and setting that trap to where that person is just, there's just little asks to kind of like get that person kind of toe in the water, foot in the water, leg in the water, until that person is eventually immersed. And by then, because they feel like it was their choice to go into the deep end, they turn around to look and feel like, well, I can't ask for help because I chose to be here. Does that make, like, I feel like a lot of times it's that tricky piece that, people on the outside looking in will see the behavior even of that person and say, well, they chose to run away from home, or they, were acting out. And when that person is in the midst of being trafficked, there's a lot of behaviors too that seem contrary to someone needing help or being coerced.
Yeah. Okay. That's good, and that helps us understand too, what is that illusion of choice, that gradual progression in where suddenly you find yourself way deeper than you ever thought that you would be, but yet you look And it seems like because it was so gradual and so insidious and so subtle, it does at times make you feel as though, and others from the outside looking in say it looks as though there may have been some element of choice, when the reality is it was a master manipulator, a master at coercion. All right. So that helps us understand what trafficking is, including just the central element of coercion. How about then some statistics around trafficking, both in the United States and globally? And then what do those statistics tell us? And are there ways that those statistics can be misunderstood or misused? Robert, thoughts on statistics?
Yeah, I think just from past collaborations with Angie, I know we both have a healthy skepticism for statistics, and that's true in trafficking as it is in child abuse more broadly, right? We know that both crimes are just tremendously underreported. So as we mentioned, statistics certainly want to have humility of what we know, what we don't know. The statistics I find useful are ones that are percentages of known from fairly large entities like NCMEC, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, Polaris, which operates the National Human Trafficking Hotline, entities like that, with the understanding that even there, we're really getting a small picture of sort of the broader reality. So with that sort of as a key asterisk on a statistical discussion, Thorne had a really interesting statistic that nearly half of all known instances of child trafficking begin with familial involvement, and that familial involvement is 4 times more prevalent in child trafficking than it is in adult trafficking. So it really undercuts that narrative that I know we're going to speak to about that sort of initial violence as an entry point, as you mentioned, Angie, particularly to sex trafficking. Very often this is someone that the child perceives as a loving relationship. That's the entry point into trafficking. And very often that's actually a family member. I think of my home state of West Virginia. Very often what this looked like is mom or dad engaging in bringing the child into sex trafficking in exchange for funds, often purchased or often utilized to purchase illicit substances, or in exchange for illicit substances directly, without sort of the cash piece of it. That's just what it tends to look like, and that's by no means a West Virginia specific piece. The Thorne stat is national. There's just tremendous familial involvement when it comes to entry points of trafficking in particular, and especially child trafficking. I think another piece to point out is the rarity of kidnapping as it relates to human trafficking and what it looks like. The stereotypical stranger kidnapping, those stats have actually been stable for about 30 years, ever since sort of the stranger danger era of the 1980s. You've had pretty stable stranger kidnapping, somewhere in the neighborhood of 300 to 315 stereotypical stranger kidnappings per year. You wouldn't believe that if you went off of social media or perhaps even media headlines. You might think that this is a much more common issue, and that again is not to negate the horror of that for the impacted parties, for the families. It's absolutely a nightmare scenario. It also isn't what this typically looks like. Typically, this is something that's a much more evolved and nuanced experience than sort of an overt stranger kidnapping. The Blackburn Center lists a couple top recruitment tactics as it relates to trafficking. The top one is intimate partner as a recruiter. The second is the familial piece, again, consistent with our Thorne stat. The third is posing as benefactor. Fourth is a job offer. The fifth is false promises. All of these pose as something that's not scary, that's not aggressive. It's posing as something that is beneficial and hopeful, perhaps. So that's one thing to emphasize as well, as we sort of think through what's the inconsistency between narratives of what trafficking looks like and then what it does look like from our known facts. One other stat from Thorne, they were summarizing a host of different studies, and the studies put the majority of child sex trafficking victims as being involved in the child welfare system. And there's a pretty wide range of where those studies tend to land, somewhere between 50% and 90%. Point is, it's a lot. Point is, it's a lot, and so those very often are where victims are targeted. Those that have some nexus. Maybe they're a juvenile on the juvenile docket. Maybe they've been charged with some sort of misdemeanor or felony criminal offense, and they're on that docket. Maybe they're in foster care. Maybe they've been removed from the home or the residential living facilities, what have you. Maybe they're runaway youth. That's oftentimes where a lot of this piece is. Another point to note is just the ubiquitous use of technology when it comes to trafficking recruitment. The number one known recruitment context in 2022 was Facebook, which was sort of surprising for me when that came out. Because I'm told repeatedly by teenagers that Facebook is for old people, right? But nonetheless, apparently it's utilized, and not just Facebook, certainly, but other social media contexts where individuals can get a bigger picture of an individual's life, their dreams, the potential vulnerabilities, etc. So yeah, those are a few things to throw out. There are many more. From a global perspective, again, the International Labor Organization has an estimate of 49.6 million individuals living in modern slavery in 2021. They estimate 75% of those forced into commercial sexual exploitation were female, and that 12% of all those in forced labor were children. So again, sobering numbers at the global level. Again, I think healthy skepticism of statistics is warranted because of how underreported this piece is, and because trafficking flourishes in dark spaces where there aren't eyes and there aren't ears, and that's part of what enables it.
Yeah.
Just the thought that 50 million is underreporting.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Wow. So that gives us then a sense of what is human trafficking, what are some important statistics. Granted, the power of these statistics is limited, but some important things that help us understand some elements of trafficking. One of the things I thought that was really interesting about the statistics that you used is they brought up that there are multiple types of human trafficking. It's not just this one monolithic thing, human trafficking, but there are so many subcategories of human trafficking. Angie, can you help us understand some of those different types of trafficking a little bit?
Yeah, actually, Polaris Project has a really good resource. There are actually 25 typologies of human trafficking in the United States, labor and sex trafficking. And so they kind of break it down into what labor trafficking can look like, which can be anywhere that people can work, right? But also like panhandling, like circus, like traveling, sales, those kind of outside the box perimeters for labor trafficking. And then with sex trafficking, we have a couple of types and then subtypes within that. So Robert said, he already said familial trafficking. So someone in the family taking advantage of another person in the family for their gain, whether that's for drugs, for money, for rent, to pay the rent, like whatever that need is in that family. And they kind of pose it as like, hey, you're part of this family. Like you got to earn your keep. You got to do your part. You don't want to let us down. We see that a lot in generational trafficking, intergenerational trafficking in families. And then, of course, the typical what everybody sees as trafficking, what's been portrayed on the movies, that Romeo, we call them Romeo pimps, that romantic, intimate partner relationship with the trafficker. And also, women are traffickers too. So, like a trafficker can look like anyone. It doesn't have a specific type, just like anyone can be trafficked. And then you have like a CEO business relationship type of trafficker. You have also survival trafficking, which I think we haven't covered yet. And that's where you have runaways and kids that are, I hate this word, throwaways. And those are kids that are in environments that they either have a they come out as gay, or they are rebelling against the authority in the home and told, like, you're not going to do that here, or we don't accept you here, and so you need to get out. And they're kind of just thrown out on the streets. And with runaways, at least they kind of feel like they have a plan in their head, even though they have no idea like what's waiting for them on the other side of that. With kids that are kicked out, like, they don't have a plan. Like, they are just kind of just winging it. And so survival trafficking really looks like somebody that needs food, shelter, any kind of basic need you can think of, and somebody's coming in and taking advantage of that. So they might not have a direct like trafficker per se is what you would see, but it's they're just trying to survive, and someone takes advantage of that. Somebody that wants to purchase sex from that individual will take advantage of that youth or that adult. And then we have gang controlled trafficking, being trafficked within gangs, and then ritualistic or religious trafficking within those contexts too. So it can look many different ways. Like Robert said, there are as many types of relationships as you can think of, and that's how it looks. Really, here, anywhere you can take advantage of someone.
Wow, that's just a ton of different ways that it could look. Are there common dynamics that occur? I mean, earlier you had talked about coercion, so like coercion is a significant piece associated with it. Are there other dynamics that come into play?
Of course, like vulnerabilities. Like, where is somebody vulnerable? We all human beings have blind spots. I kind of describe vulnerabilities as what is our blind spot. So what is, I don't want to say weakness, because I think that negates someone, but like, what are those things that are needs in your life or desires in your life? Like, is it a youth that's in foster care that desires to have a family, to belong somewhere, to have people care for them? Is it somebody that is it a youth that wants to like have a modeling career and like feels like that they can be an influencer and wants to kind of gain kind of that acceptance? That's a form of acceptance, right? Like, in that. So if we think of taking it to psychology, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and each of those tiers have different basic needs that everybody has. And so what a trafficker will do is they'll look at like, what is that? Because what works on the youth that needs belonging, that's in foster care, won't work on the youth that maybe they do come from a little more secure situation, but they want to be famous. They're not gonna use the same tactic, so to speak. And so it's really what makes them susceptible. Like, what's their fairy tale? What's their need? What's their desire? Wow. Where's their entry point?
Wow. What's their fairy tale? I mean, just the picture that paints of somebody going back to that coercion, that takes the time to find out somebody's fairy tale and then weaponizes their fairy tale. Whether that's a kid or a college student or anybody else, somebody that comes in and weaponizes a person's fairy tale. That, wow.
When we think about child abuse, right? Like when people are abusing kids, they really are, they're taking that time to groom, to get to know, to find out like, what kind of, candy that kid likes, or what kind of like, what is their desire. And so it's parallel with that. And also I will add that over 89% of victims of human trafficking have had a history of childhood sexual abuse. So I think that's an important 89. Stat to note. Yeah.
Wow. That's a huge overlap. It's huge. All right. Well, thanks for helping us understand some of the types of human trafficking and some of the dynamics that come into play. Yeah. So as we talk about human trafficking and the statistics, and just even think about what all is involved. And I can't shake that image of weaponizing somebody's fairy tale. That sounds so discouraging.
Yeah.
In the middle of that discouragement, is there anything that encourages you? Is there anything that gives you hope? Where do we find hope in the middle of all this stuff? Angie, any
Yeah.
thoughts on that?
Yeah. I think we find hope in places like this where we're having discussions, right? Where we're opening up the opportunity to engage in conversation about it. I have hope when I work with social workers, I work with law enforcement, I work with probation officers and people and medical professionals. I have hope when I'm working with them, and I know many people slip through the cracks, right? In each of those spaces, whether they're in the emergency room or whether they're in foster care, and because there is a more awareness, right, being brought, I see where there's more education, and so with that piece, I really do, I feel like that brings hope in the sense of people are becoming aware of it, and if they can get the right kind of education about it, right, and I just see it in those that really do want to make a difference. They really do have the heart to really, how can I help, how can I make an impact. And so, because we do see so much darkness, right,
Mhm.
so much just people taking advantage.
Yeah. So much darkness, but in the middle of that darkness, there are reasons for hope. There are elements that can be encouraging. That
Yeah.
doesn't mean that the difficulty or the pain doesn't exist and isn't also there, but there are those pieces of hope.
Yeah,
Thank you
well,
for sharing
I
such
call
a,
them
yeah,
glimmers, like glimmers.
glimmers.
They're glimmers. Just look for the glimmers. Like in West Virginia, we have an amazing organization called Libera. And they go in and work right now. They're working with kids aging out of the foster care system,
Yeah,
really to help them figure out how to get jobs and just really support, really, because I think that's a big vulnerable population, right?
yeah, it is.
Like a lot of youth aging out of the foster care system don't have that support network. So that's a glimmer that I see and I find hope in. I find hope in, the state of California gave us a grant to really educate them on prevention, like bringing
Mhm.
prevention to youth that are in foster care or youth across the board, right? Because all youth are vulnerable.
Yeah,
Um, and so, in those
glimmers,
spaces, glimmers.
glimmers. Wow. There's glimmers of hope, but there are also times of discouragement, times when almost it seems like the intense harm that has been done to somebody already um, actually ends up being co-opted and taken over by somebody else for their own personal use. Um, Robert, can you talk to us a little bit about what are some of those things that can be discouraging or that can actually be um, co-opting this very real and very important issue of harm that is done to people?
Yeah, absolutely. It's another form of exploitation to take the
Mm,
reality of suffering and to portray it in a certain way for personal or frankly political gain, right? And so we see that unfortunately on modern landscape. That's just the reality of modern U.S. political life. Wherever you find yourself on that spectrum, there are individuals that often weaponize narratives in order to frame something in a way that's favorable for a particular political party or for a particular outcome. And it's very problematic. I think whenever we're going to represent something horrific that has happened, whenever we're going to represent someone else's pain, I think it's always worth asking that question of why am I doing this? Am I doing this for my gain? Am I doing this for my organization's gain? Am I doing this for my political party's gain? or am I genuinely trying to raise awareness on this issue? Certainly, individuals, regardless of whether they're involved in politics or not, should highlight these issues, right? I don't think any of us would disagree with that. These are critical topics that need to be addressed. I think there certainly are, legislative implications, and pieces like that to issues relating to trafficking. But yeah, unfortunately, just in the hyperpartisanship of the world in which we live, it creates this sort of us versus them dynamic where some won't believe allegations if they're made against someone in their political party or in their church or in their school or in their community. And the reality is, trafficking doesn't care whether there's an R or a D next to your name. It really doesn't. Same with child abuse. We know that child abuse is ubiquitous. It's in across the spectrum, churches, schools, etc. Right? That's why this organization exists, is because of how much the sin and evil of child abuse is tragically prevalent in the church, and that's true of trafficking as well. So we can't create sort of this us versus them dynamic where exploitation is something that someone else is doing, or it's some other entity or conglomeration of entities is doing. No, what does it look like to prevent exploitation in my circle, in my community, where I'm not pointing the finger somewhere else, taking ownership for justice in my circles of influence, right? And that's something that I think is tragically not always prevalent just in our political landscape. I think another piece of this, I am actually very encouraged by how many discussions are happening around issues of trafficking in particular, and child abuse more broadly. I mean, we think back to Angie. I entered this field around the same time as you did, and these discussions were not nearly as frequent 10 years ago, 15 years ago. It wasn't. They just were not as common, and they were rare and they were isolated. So I think collectively our social understanding in some ways seems to be increasing. You don't have to win the argument that abuse exists anymore. At least we've crossed that threshold, right? At least we can all agree that, okay, clearly we have a problem. I think the concerning part is, do we know what problem? Because if we have the problem wrong, our odds of getting the solution wrong are pretty good. And so do we know what our problem actually is? And so this goes to, some of the fictionalized accounts. And I'll be honest, maybe I shouldn't on a recorded meeting, but Taken's a fun movie, right? I mean, it's a fun movie. Liam Neeson's great. I mean, the telephone call is epic. It's fun. I enjoy action films. It's a fun movie. It's also fictional, right? And it's also not what it looks like. And the danger with films like Taken, like Sound of Freedom, like other movies, setting aside the entertainment value, is is there something in there that is not congruent with reality, and do we take it to be reality, and do we extrapolate it to what most trafficking looks like? Certainly some instances of kidnapping do occur, and again, not minimizing those horrific incidents, but if survivors can't recognize themselves in those narratives, and if individuals are trained to say, oh, that's trafficking, does that mean you can't recognize other forms of trafficking that are actually much more prevalent in the United States anyway? And so that's the concern that I would have in terms of, are we accurately identifying the problem? It's good that we're having discussions, but what's the quality of those discussions? And what are the solutions if we have the problem wrong? I'm curious, Angie, if you have any sort of related thought.
Yes, I kind of want to, I'll back up to where you were talking about the us against them narrative. And I kind of will put this spin, because I work with survivors and walk alongside in the journey. And the trafficker also creates us against them. So if the church or society is creating an us against them, and the trafficker is creating an us against them that are opposite us against them, right? Like, it then becomes this space of like, I can't ask for help, I can't reach out for help, and it also like just continues to fuel the narrative that runaway is somehow like making a choice in their exploitation, right? Or fill in the blank. And so like that us against them narrative is very dangerous. And when we think about the before someone is trafficked, like maybe they come from a place where there wasn't healthy relationships, right? They don't know what emotion regulation is. I mean, let's get honest, not a lot of people know what emotion regulation is. Not a lot of people know like what window of tolerance is, and that type of thing. And so they go into relationships that like really would be a violent relationship or an unhealthy relationship, but they don't have any gauge. It continues to further like isolate that person. But when we talk about movies like Taken, like it just, who doesn't like a good guy gets bad guy and there's a happy ending? Like we all want that. Like we sit around and we have within an hour on the Law and Order, we have a beginning, middle, and end. It's in a box, and it's taken care of, and there's justice. And I am a big like fan of those kind of shows and movies, but also being in the work that I do, the harm behind that is one, people aren't seeing how it really looks in their neighborhood, in their community where they are, and two, it continues to fuel the us against them, and three, like those that are victims don't see themselves, like you said, Robert. They don't. When you Google, I've asked people, what do you think of when you close your eyes for a second? What do you think of when you hear the words human trafficking? What image pops up? And it's always like the duct tape. It's always like the hand over the mouth. There's always like somebody thrown in a basement. So a victim would say, like, that's not me. Like, I can walk around my neighborhood. I can, I go to school. I'm free to do those things. And it's so much more than that physical, it's that psychological chains that are holding them. And so, yeah, those kind of movies just though they have a good guy, bad guy, the happy ending doesn't come in reality, because nobody kicks down doors in reality most of the time to go in and rescue somebody, and then there's not a lot of aftercare programs either, because really the hard work starts for a victim of human trafficking when they exit, when they get out, when they are able to through whatever means escape. That's like the beginning of the hard work. And a lot of people have already left because the credits are rolling right when the hard work is just getting started.
Wow. And then you throw in some of the time when technology may have been used, and now maybe there is photo or video of that person being abused or exploited. And Martin, in her study of the effects of child sexual abuse material, she described it as, you never enter post-traumatic stress because the trauma's never over.
Yeah, it's reliving it over and over and over again. And it's so hard. That's the one thing I try to help youth understand. And I want like those that work with youth and parents to understand. It just takes that one picture to be out there, or that one video to be given to somebody. Maybe that person even trusts and thinks that they have a strong relationship with, and that person gets angry, or that person thinks it's funny to share that video with someone else. Then that video gets shared with someone else. And we do this in the SHIELD body safety assemblies in middle schools and high schools in West Virginia, where we talk about technology and sexting and sextortion, because we're seeing sextortion like just climb. And it's just kind of taking over, because when you're hiding behind a screen, I don't know who's on the other side of that. And so they can send me a picture, and now with AI, they can send me a really good picture of who they look and how they want to present, and they can create this whole other person, where you have people thinking that they're talking to someone, and they're actually talking to an adult that's
Wow.
in the next state, and they're sending pictures, they're sending videos, and then that person has that content. And I kind of just want to just bring up, I know we didn't talk about this, but one of the ways that one of the things we need to really work on is the demand, right? Like Like,
Right.
who's out there buying? Like, people, like, the demand piece is that I think is that one that, like, kind of gets by, right? You hear a lot about the trafficker, you hear a lot about the victim. The buyer is the one that's who's propelling the demand, is the
Yeah.
person that's buying.
Yeah.
Um,
If there's no demand, there is no trafficking. I can set up a stand with all the bags of my dog's crap that I've picked up, but if nobody is going to want to buy them, and I'm pretty sure
right.
nobody's going to want to buy my dog's excrement,
Mm-hmm.
um, there is no market.
Mm-hmm.
But people want to buy other humans.
Yeah, so we got to look a little bit deeper to how we as a society are also propelling that too.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. We're getting close to where we want to switch over to the question and answer period. We've gotten a number of good questions in, and we'll try to get to a couple of them. But before we do that, I wonder if each of you have maybe just one or two things that you can think of. One, what can the church do to understand, engage, and actually take some meaningful steps with regards to trafficking prevention and response? And two, even if I'm not part of a faith community, or if my faith community is choosing not to be involved in this for whatever reason, what can I as an individual do? So one, what can a faith community, a church do? And two, what can I as an individual do?
Yeah, the church can do a lot. I think one of those is take Jesus seriously. I think
Mhm.
take scripture seriously. Scripture talks about exploitation and oppression an awful lot.
Yeah.
It's just the reality. Isaiah in particular has some powerful passages, and there's many I could quote. I'll go to Isaiah 117: learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless, plead the case of the widow. To paraphrase the chapter of Isaiah 58, as these individuals are speaking and asking, Lord, why don't you bless us? Because we do all these things, we have all these festivals, we have all these fasts, and the Lord says, on the day you have all those, you oppress, you exploit,
Mhm.
you're manipulating this, the economically, I think, more economically vulnerable individuals, and so you can't fast and ask for my blessing in that while you do
Yeah.
these things. You just can't. There's these social obligations you have to treat people made in my image well. So I think take scripture seriously. In terms of what that looks like, I think there's internal implications for a church, and I think there's external implications for a church. Internally, rejecting that us versus them dynamic that we've talked about. The reality is exploitation absolutely can and does happen in churches, including child abuse, including human trafficking. So, what internal systems are in place to prevent that from happening? And how robust are they? So there's sort of that piece of it when it comes to safeguarding and pieces like that. And obviously, Grace does a ton of work equipping churches in that context. But then also, from an internal perspective, churches can be present in the life of individuals for a long time in a way that other agencies can't, in ways that law
Yeah.
enforcement agencies can't. Social services agencies, unfortunately, often can't. And so a church can be an ongoing, meaningful, patient, non judgmental presence in an individual's life in a way that nothing else on the planet can be, if done well. And so that's certainly a piece of it. Externally, we are a city on a hill, salt of the earth. So, what connections can be made between your local church and agencies like CASA, court-appointed special advocates, or your local child advocacy center, or your local domestic violence shelter? These are all locations where there are likely to be, not likely, there are victims
Mhm.
of child abuse and human trafficking. And these are under-resourced entities that need help desperately. They might need volunteers, they might need money, they might need awareness, they might need just a spot in your service to talk about what they do. But you can make a tremendous impact. And again, I use local multiple times for a reason, that local impact where you're at. Also, local social services are often in need of assistance. I think of cases that I've seen where children were removed from homes because there were inadequate sleeping arrangements. Well, a church can go and get a bunk bed, right? Like there
Yeah.
are things like that that can absolutely intersect in favorable ways. So there's that internal piece and there's that external piece.
Yeah.
Angie, any thoughts?
Yeah, I have lots of thoughts.
How about 5 minutes of thoughts?
Okay. I do want to say, like, individuals can respond just like you all are doing here, that those of you that joined us, like, that's the first step, is taking that initiative to educate yourself. And also the other piece too, as what individuals can do is looking at our own lives and holding ourselves accountable for the ways that, not that we traffic people, but are there things in our life, are there things that we've kind of, I don't want to say allowed, but like brought into our space, that also fuels the objectification of human beings. I think somebody asked about pornography, and I'm not going to get into the question part of it yet, but I think individuals can really like look into their own hearts and see, like, where are the areas that, like, are there things that I'm doing that is kind of fueling the objectification, or not, maybe I'm not fueling it, but maybe I'm just kind of, I hear people say things and I don't like respond to them. And I think that's not part of exploitation, but it absolutely is. It builds the blocks to get to that. Another thing that they can do is a lot similar to what Robert said. Just like a trafficker looks for the needs, like that's what we as a church, we as individuals need to. Where are the needs in our community?
Mm-hmm.
Like, where are the vulnerable populations? Where are those that need mentoring? Where are those youth that need someone to just come in and teach life skills? Like, where are those spaces that the traffickers are feeling? How can we begin to engage? Educate your own children about it. Like, there's ways that we can educate our own kids. And I think the mistake that we make, though, is we kind of wait until we feel that huge like risk or warning, and then we jump in and bombard our kids with all this information that they're not going to retain, like before they go like out to hang out with their friends, or now watch for this and watch for this. Well, that's not really the time to have those conversations. The time to have those conversations is just in everyday life. And so starting very young with like teaching consent and about their bodies, and I think those are very tangible ways that we can help with trafficking. And then hosting a training, hosting a presentation at your church. If your church doesn't want to be part of that, maybe finding out, like, where are there some conferences that are reputable, and maybe educating yourself, seeing like, are there safe houses in my area that serve trafficking survivors? Are there places that I can plug in that serve vulnerable populations that I can begin to impact and do, an ending the gang group? Or maybe I can do an education with, there's so many really good quality curriculums, like Not a Number. Love 146 has one called Not a Number, and they go into high schools in their health class and teach. And so there's a lot of different ways that we can get involved.
Wow. Thank you both for sharing those, and thank you both also just for the incredible insight that you have when it comes to understanding human trafficking, and that it's something that is definitely beyond what we often see portrayed in the media, that we need to be aware that it is more than just what is portrayed in the media, because if the only thing we have is what popular media shows us about human trafficking, it's not just that that's not helpful, it's that that's harmful if we don't recognize that it is beyond just what is shown in popular media. So thank you both for the insight that you shared with us today. Want to get to a few questions. I'll take just the first question. Somebody had asked, are there organizations out there that are helping churches, helping faith communities to respond in a more trauma-informed way? And I'll mention just a few organizations that come to mind. Grace does a lot of work on trying to help faith communities understand trauma. Human trafficking is a form of a traumatic event. So helping churches understand trauma and what that is, and then understanding how realizing what trauma is actually should impact how we interact with each other. And that is nothing more than a definition of trauma-informed practice. We understand trauma, and then we have that understanding of trauma impact how we interact with each other. That is trauma-informed practice. Grace does extensive work with churches and ministries to understand that. But there are also a number of other organizations. You previously mentioned the SHIELD Task Force, which is in West Virginia. The Zero Abuse Project with their Keeping Faith trainings that they offer a couple of times a year remotely, and then go in person to offer those trainings as well. So the Zero Abuse Project, SHIELD Task Force, Zero Abuse Project. Christian faith communities aren't the only type of faith communities. There are other faith communities. For example, there are Jewish faith communities. And Sacred Spaces is an organization that works extensively with Jewish faith communities to better understand trauma, and then to explore how does that understanding of a trauma impact how we interact with each other. Robert, you mentioned earlier children's advocacy centers. Children's advocacy centers, many of them will be open to working with faith communities, and a few children's advocacy centers actually have a chaplain in place. For example, the Julie Valentin Center in South Carolina has a chaplain in place specifically to help churches in the area better understand abuse, better understand sexual assault, better understand trauma. And then how does that understanding of trauma impact how we interact with each other? And there are other ministries. For example, I'm in Minnesota, and so I'm aware of the House of Faith and Freedom. Their focus is intimate partner violence, but as we talked about, sometimes those intimate relationships actually end up being who recruits people into trafficking. But they also seek to help faith communities understand trauma, and then how does that impact how we interact with each other. And then Care in Action Minnesota is another organization here in Minnesota that's working to help organizations better understand trauma, and then take that understanding of trauma to impact our interactions with each other. There are a number of other questions that are out there. One question, and I think we're only going to be able to get to one of these questions. So I know that that's going to leave a lot of questions unanswered. Please send us these unanswered questions to info@netgrace.org. info@netgrace.org, because we do want to answer these questions. It's just that we're running out of time. So one question that came in, it speaks to a very difficult dynamic. What about a family whose teen doesn't want to come back home? Mm-hmm. Law enforcement says they're just going to run again. Yeah. Most programs require youth to want to participate and be admitted into a program. But what if the teen doesn't want to? I mean, the people in that teen's life who are supposed to be there caring for them, whether it's a parent, whether it's a youth leader, whether it's a pastor, whether it's a mentor, whoever it is, oftentimes those people who have said, I'm going to care for you, I'm going to help you, are the very ones that have caused the harm, whether it's through abuse or to have actually brought them into trafficking in the first place. What do we do then when that teen doesn't want to come back home, when that teen doesn't want to participate in a program that in their minds may just be another source of harm?
Oh, that is definitely a difficult question, because if you have the people that are supposed to be helping that aren't helping, then I like, I feel like when somebody is going through that, I was that teen. I will say I
Mm,
was that teen. I went into foster care, and I was that difficult teen that did not want help because of, and I think, Pete, it goes to what you were saying about trauma in the brain. I think people need to understand what trauma does to someone and how it stunts them and all their developmental stages, and what ACEs are and how that affects
yeah.
youth. Because I think that if there is someone in that person's life that can just continue to just stay there and be consistent,
Mm,
set boundaries that are firm but loving, and be consistent in that youth life. I train social workers all the time on how to deal with those difficult youth because one, because I was one, and two, because like I know, like, it's hard to sit there and see somebody with such potential seemingly
yeah,
throw it all away.
yeah.
And then the other piece to that is at Ending the Game, endingthegame.com, we have actually an online 2-hour training about coercion specifically and identity disturbance. And I think when we understand that, we understand the dynamics of, we answer the question, like, why do they keep going back? Like, why do they keep choosing their trafficker, and what trauma bonds and those kind of things do. And so I think understanding trauma in the brain, and just being a consistent um, person that is in that person's life, continuing to kind of pull out the strengths in them, because that person knows, that youth knows everything that's wrong with them. They've been told by people their whole lives, like,
Yeah,
the things that are wrong. Like, we have to start building on people's strengths
yeah.
if we're wanting to see really long impact and lasting impact.
That's so good. That's so good. Robert, any thoughts before we wrap up on that question?
Yeah, I think so it depends on what your role is, right? If you're social services, that's going to imply one response. If you're a church, and you have these concerns, obviously reporting these concerns
Mhm.
for the good of the child. I handled a docket of about 200 juveniles that had significant runaways. One of the things that greatly disturbed me and still does is once they ran, how few or how much of the time no one looked. Right after they ran, no one looked for them, and so that's a common dynamic, horrifyingly enough, just within the United States, that many times no one is looking for these kids. So if you have some sort of connection to these children, yeah, I think tremendous patience. I think tremendous empathy for the related trauma that they're going through. I think reporting. I think certainly reporting those concerns in hopes of effective systemic interventions, and then just education on how to best intersect with them.
Well, thank you both very much again, just for your incredible insights, your wisdom, and for helping us better understand human trafficking. If you had a question and we weren't able to get to it today, again, please send it to us at info@netgrace.org. Thanks for joining us today. It's been great to have you here for this discussion. In November, we'll have a couple of different events that are coming up as part of our fall fundraising campaign. So please join us for those. Again, that campaign starts on November 16th. On November 20th, we'll have a board event where the board will share some of the things that brought them to Grace and some of the hopes that they have for Grace, and also for the Every Church Empowered Fund, which is the focus of our fall fundraising campaign, trying to equip churches that may have barriers to accessing some of the supports that Grace provides, so that any church can access those supports. Any survivor can access those supports, whether or not they have the funds. And then on the 27th of November, our keynote was Scott McKnight, author of the book, A Church Called Tove. Thanks again for joining us today, and I hope the rest of your day, the rest of your week goes well. So thank you. Bye now.